Okay, this one's going to be fairly short. I think the module, the contemporary Polynesian one's pretty straightforward. I'll be getting more into it in next week, but I want to segue into Micronesia before I run out of time. When you're looking at contemporary Polynesian societies, you have to remember, I think, unlike Micronesia, was what we'll get into next, there's a tremendously huge amount of baggage. We've been going into this all semester long in terms of what the expectations that other people outside have of Polynesia. These are tremendously strong and very powerful and persistent stereotypes that have been going on now for, in many cases, 300 years. And on one hand, this has given access to resources, specifically tourism, to a lot of the region. On the other hand, it can be a very constraining, reality, especially when money's attached. One of the classic examples here that I use in the Hawaii class is the whole issue of the word mahalo, for example, which is pretty ambivalently a Hawaiian word, but is demanded in the tourism business. You can get terminated for a cause here in Hawaii if you don't use that at the end of an interaction with a tourism or a customer. More importantly would be this idea of this live aloha sphere, this whole type of stuff that's constantly pushed on the population here by Hawaii Tourism Authority and other groups, government especially, because there's, literally it is the revenue stream that runs this place. And you can see it right now with the COVID impacts. When tourism's down, when tourism stops, literally, the whole place just falls apart like a deck of cards, because we don't really have any other industry that functions here. Even a lot of construction here that's still going on is predicated on the fact that tourists will return. So in that context, what you have is, for example, if you might have worked in this business, if you're somehow involved in a part of the industry or just in any social industry where you get a tip. Here in Hawaii, tips are related, on one hand, sort of an expectation of them. On the other hand, the nicer you are to a customer, the more you're liable to get a tip or a bigger tip. And so what happens is, in some way, shape, or form, you've commodified. You've put a cash value on social behavior. You reward stereotyped, friendly, quote, Hawaiian, unquote, social behavior by virtue of a tip. And so the more you, quote, live aloha, unquote, the more you get paid. And the more your employer gets paid, theoretically. So at some point, what you've taken as a social value, and you've now made it an economic engine. And this is a really, really complicated situation. In some ways, this is probably part of the distinguishing characteristic that you find in Central Polynesia when you look at folks, especially in Hawaii, but also Tahiti. And they say that, well, you sort of sold out your culture. Because in the Central Polynesian area, of course, you don't have a lot of tourists. And so therefore, people can feel comfortable, though I think that's not accurate, that isn't commodified. I would argue, we don't have time for this class, but if at some point, if you think about it, commodification in terms of getting access to stuff is actually typical throughout all the world, and here, especially in Polynesia. And conservative families that argue that they're the most traditional in Samoa or Tonga are very good at manipulating social relationships to gain things. So, in their own way, they'll be very unhappy to hear it. They've also commodified those relationships, since in the past it didn't lead to stuff. So this whole commodification thing is a problem. It's a problem when you start to try to figure out who I am, what are my values, how much can I be Hawaiian or Maori or Tahitian or something like that, and engage in the 21st century, especially in an industry which directly or indirectly probably ties into tourism. So in some way, shape, or form, people are paying me to act like they expect me to act because of the label that they've attached to me, and also maybe the label that I've taken on. Remember what the definition of ethnicity is. What you also tend to find, ironically, then, is that the same areas in Central Polynesia that tend to be very comfortable with their cultural consistency also are very active in out-migrating their members to the areas that are less culturally stable. So Tongans, for example, a huge number of Tongans live in Australia and in New Zealand. And they very frequently, and Samoans very frequently get into tiffs all the time with Maori. And it's almost invariably, especially in the school system, about like who's a real Polynesian type thing. You don't see that as much here, but I think in part that's just because there's more segregation. I think especially because, well, you do see it a fair amount on Maui, where you have a large Tongan population, let's say Maui High or something, with people identify as Hawaiian. Don't think you see it quite as much on Oahu because this place is so bizarre. It's so different. I don't think it really shows up to the same extent that you'd see somewhere else. And a large part of your other Polynesians are here in Oahu, specifically because they're making money directly or indirectly in the tourism sector. So what you find is the areas that see themselves as the conservative standard bearers, if you would, of Polynesian values, are very good at sending members out. But ironically, if you think about that, if you watch that Samoan, the gangs, the SOS gang in LA, you realize that on one hand, those Central Polynesian groups do have maybe a stronger grasp of traditional culture, but then they're also entirely dependent on the money sent back by these folks outside. And of course, they also amplify the power and importance of family. So those folks will send money back. So, commodification is a really, really slippery thing to get hold of, because the minute you hear someone talking about how virtuous they are and that they aren't involved in commodification, I would be really suspicious, because in many cases they actually are. They just don't really understand how it's playing out in their situation. So what you find is that when you look at ethnicity and Polynesians as ethnic groups, and who's a member and who isn't, it becomes a very, very, very complicated situation, as we've seen now. This is also made very complicated by the virtue that you sort of have three sets of players depending where you are in Polynesia. Here in Hawaii and in parts of Samoa, it's the United States. In other parts of Polynesia, the Cooks, Samoa, the country, Fiji and stuff like that, it's the British, and by default the New Zealanders, Australians, sort of like second-tier Brits. In the eastern part of Polynesia, it's the French. If you get really far east and you go to Rapa Nui, to Easter Island, then it's the Chileans. So what you find is this very complicated set of situations where the external players are still huge factors. Much of tourism in Central and Eastern Polynesia is almost entirely New Zealand, Australian. French occasionally, but it's really expensive for French to fly to someplace like Tahiti, so they generally don't. Americans don't go to any place but Hawaii. They very rarely. It's very adventurous for Americans to go down to Tahiti or Bora Bora or anything. You would never see them, in Tonga or Samoa, except one or two maybe. So what you find is the impact of tourism, directly or indirectly, is pretty much throughout the region, but how it impacts the region varies from place to place. Are there actually tourists there, or are you sending folks from your area to someplace that has tourism? And so this is key, but one of the things that you have to remember when we look compared to Micronesia, which we're going to next, is the fact that Polynesia does have the ability to have tourism. If you think of when we looked at Melanesia, especially the really creepy video on the tourism in Melanesia, I'm sorry, I forgot the title. What you get is the realization that it's very hard to expand a tourism sector if the potential tourists have a negative stereotype. In Micronesia, there is no stereotype, positive or negative. Micronesia doesn't exist except to some people as a remembrance of World War II, which we'll get into. So World War II is a much bigger factor in Micronesia. In Polynesia, it's pretty much entirely absent. Yeah, Pearl Harbor's a huge tourist attraction, stuff like that, though. I'm sure someone could do an absolutely fascinating dissertation on what a tourist see when they go to Pearl Harbor, what it is they're consuming, what it is they're looking for. There was a really nice article written years ago by a guy in the geography department when I was there at UH, who's now at Smithsonian, on the image of Pearl Harbor, sort of a modern Heiau. This is a sort of a moral, social value sacrifice that Americans sort of see as part of their national identity, which I think is pretty accurate. If I find the article, maybe I'll attach it so you can take a look at it if you want. So it's sort of this paradox, but Polynesia does have the potential of generating money from tourism directly or indirectly, and that gives them a huge leg up. The other part is that the educational systems in Polynesia, by virtue of direct French influence in the East, huge infusions of money from New Zealand in the central part, and you know, in the United States and Hawaii, and to a lesser extent in Samoa, means that most of your educational systems in Polynesia are decent. They're not necessarily great, but they're definitely better than most of Melanesia, and they're a hell of a lot better than we'll see in Micronesia, with the exception of maybe Guam. And you have to remember that what this means is if you're one of these folks that's migrating out, it means that your ability to function in another society, in Auckland, New Zealand, in Sydney, Australia, in Paris maybe, or in LA, is much better than we're going to see when we get into Micronesia, where most of that region is just basically sandbag. They just don't have that educational basis that they need. So they're just, they start the game, you know, with minus 10 points if you want to think of it that way. So Polynesians do have some advantages. And, you know, I've gone through here and sort of got a shopping list of what you see as sort of is, and we mentioned this last time, these sort of persistent ethnic values. I won't get too much into this. This comes up pretty much, I think, in the video. One of the things that you do find that's interesting that's occurring more and more in Polynesians that are leaving Central Polynesia is that the concept of the matai, the person who is in charge of the family, which has become a very complex phenomenon in the Samoas and also in Tonga, because these have become highly politicized. And families use these as sort of as a competition against other families. Remember, I mentioned earlier in the semester that Samoan family, or I should say Polynesian families, are incredibly competitive. Polynesians in general are quite incredibly competitive. Watch them play rugby or soccer, and you'll figure it out in a second. So in that context, what you find is as the motivation for control has changed, what a matai has changed. And if you actually see this, a fair amount of that messaging occurs in that SOS gang video. Listen carefully to what the matai are saying about the guy's melody, how they're making this distinction between who they are and who those guys are. There's some really interesting unintentional messaging going off, which I think was probably intentionally grabbed by the guy that did the video. The more I watch that thing, I've seen like 1 million times, the more I'm impressed with how sophisticated it is. There's a bunch of levels of the messaging in there, which I think is probably intentional, but most people won't notice. What you find here, this is also true in Aotearoa, which are your two largest, you know, sort of bases of Central Polynesians outside of home, is that the power of matai has disappeared or has dropped off radically, and it's been largely replaced by pastors. Even in the Central Territories, but especially when people move out, they tend to go to churches where the church will have a couple of families of like the base congregation. So the guy who's in charge of that, I'm just going to call him pastor, and I think they have different terms depending on what they are, ends up being in many cases taking on much of the role of matai. They end up as the peacemaker between conflicts, then as the person that tries to smooth relationships between families if they get all fractured out. Now, having said that, those pastors, since they're pretty much tied to their congregation, don't generally have a lot of power outside. So, for example, if you go to the west side of this island, you'll find that the pastors of the various churches, which have Tongan or Samoan congregations, have in many cases, act very much like a matai. And they have very explicit roles they play out that have become ever more complicated over the last 30, 40, 50 years. Even down to, for example, being involved in gift giving, being involved in family formal apologies to other families for offenses, to trying to structure relationships, peacemaking between families before it turns into blood feuds. Things that traditionally would have been the role of a matai, in many cases now have evolved to the pastor. Now you still have matais, but then the question arises, well, what are they doing if the pastor's doing their job? And that becomes one of the sort of interesting aspects of what matai are in the 21st century. And this goes back again to this idea that these changes are occurring in sometimes pretty subtle ways. So even the most conservative areas, you know, the sort of Samoa concept, is talking about, you might have the idea that you have to respect a matai, but that doesn't necessarily mean that guy's job description and what their agenda is the same as what their fathers were, or what, you know, 2 or 3 generations before were. And the fact that the pastor has eventually, by families, sort of, you know, collectively been given a lot of these responsibilities, says something about the need to, within Polynesian value systems, to have someone who is to avoid conflict. But that's not being done by the traditional person. So what you do in very Polynesian society is you basically build up a new one. How this is going to play out over the next 20, 40, 50 years, I don't know, but it's really sort of interesting how it's changing. And it's something to sort of keep a track of. You see this probably most strikingly in Fiji, which is the furthest down there, because it's your Matai there are basically the folks who are in the Council of Chiefs, which is absolutely central in all those weird sort of revolutions and counter-revolutions, etc., going on. The Veninga Monongi is in the middle of. In fact, he's frequently locking horns with those guys. So when you're looking at these, just sort of think of this and sort of, and they've got enough of these videos, I think that'll be able to sort of consume that. And we're going to segue Monday into Micronesia. We're going to have to go back into history because, again, in Micronesia, the historical component's really, really central because of how the outside world sees Micronesia. Okay? So with that, have a good weekend.